Evening, everyone. Just a word of warning. I'm getting messages saying that the frame rates may drop a little bit. Apologies for that. I've reset the router and everything. It's just not doing very well at the moment. But I thought we'd go over basically how much trouble the Conservative Party are in under Liz Truss. We're going to take a look at some of the issues with the polling. I've had a chance to look through some more things since. But we'll crack on with some of the economics-based questions first, because it's all related. Starting at the top, there are a couple of things I can answer on this. So Pete at the top was saying, no, it's not. It was someone else. Susan, has anyone study costed all the side effects of the mini-budget fiasco? And then Pete adding, the OBR are in the process of doing that. So basically, the Office of Budgetary Responsibility, they are in the process, but they've also done it. They did have a forecast ready to go for quasi-quarantine. This is what's caused a lot of the fuss of the last few days. They had a forecast. The government said they didn't want it. It was there. It was all ready. Obviously, you update it as things change. And there's two types of change. The first change is the government obviously announced things that they hadn't told the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, so they can bring that into their forecast. The way the market reacted, which is entirely predictable to any economist, but nonetheless, that also can be factored in. So they can keep updating it, but they do already have forecasts. They're available as soon as the government wants them, which they don't. In fact, I can actually say, so I did a video for the 5 o'clock talking about Labour maybe working with some Tory rebels to force the government to at least drop the cancellation of the upper tax band, or there might be some Tory MPs willing to vote against the budget. And but there's something else coming out as well. Labour are also in talks with some Tories about a humble address. Now, the idea of a humble address is it's a way of a majority of MPs directly going to, in this case, the King, was the Queen, to order the release of certain documents. So the last time it succeeded, you do occasionally get these votes, mostly, but the last time it succeeded was in 2019 with Theresa May, when she tried to block the Operation Yellowhammer documents, which was the government's emergency appraisal of what a no-deal Brexit would do. So Parliament at the time, over which she had no control at the time, ordered their release. So Keir Starmer is planning at the next opposition day, which is the day when the opposition is allowed to present things for debate, because normally it's just the government, but the opposition is allowed a day as well. They are going to seek a humble address to order the release of the forecasts in whatever state they are at the time, because they do exist. And the government are saying, yeah, you can look at them on November the 23rd. Sorry, it keeps saying I've got drop frames. It's really annoying. It is actually very annoying. So yeah, it's. Oh, I'll do this question down here. So that's the situation where we are with the forecast. They do exist. Yes, they keep having to be updated. Of course they do as things change, but they do exist. The fact that the government doesn't want anyone to see them until November, at the end of November at that, suggests that what is contained therein is not something they wish the public to see. If they select a new leader, do I think they could overtake Labour in the polls? At this point, I actually think Labour have done it. It's a little bit like this afternoon, right? The way I liken it is to watching a sports team as opposed to being the athlete. So Labour have still got a lot of work to do. Actual people in Labour, in the leadership and the wider party, well, as in the MPs and the activists, they've still got a lot of work to do. They can't just sit back now and think we've won the election. They have a lot of work to do. But me, as just an observer, can think, yeah, it's done. It's a little bit like the football. Newcastle were 3-0 up at half-time. Job done. And it was. The second half wasn't that great. Doesn't matter, they still won. Because you know what? They've done the hard work. I think the same thing of Labour. It's, I think they are going to win. I cannot see what the Tories can do to not. Because you've got to think about it. If you think, you like reverse engineer it, what do the Conservatives have to do to win? Is it completely impossible in theory? No, it's not. What they have to, they can't do it with Liz Truss. And there's two problems with Liz Truss. The first is she is crazy. Em mentioned it at the start. She's crazy. I'm now convinced of that. I'm happy to accept that Dominic Cummings was right on the ball. She is crazy. She is actually nuts. Do you know what I'm reading now? This is from her allies. This is people who are trying to support her. Liz Truss actually thinks, because there was me thinking, oh, you know, and it's still possible. Liz Truss, she knows full well what's going on. She knows she's going to wreck the economy. She doesn't care, because you think about it this way, right? So she goes to a load of companies, like corporation bosses, executives, and she says, look, I'm going to put this policy in place, right? It's going to lose me the next election. It's an absolute stinker, but it'll save you 50 billion quid. Do you think you could find it in you after I leave office to give me like a seat on the board paying, I don't know, £250,000 a year? Of course they would. You're told that your company is going to save 50 billion quid over the next year or so. Of course you'll give her £250,000 a year for the rest of her life. She does that with a few corporations. That's a nice little earner, right? Now, I'm not suggesting she is saying that, because the other side of it is she actually thinks, because this is what her allies are suggesting. She actually thinks in her head that all of this is going to work. It's never worked before, but it's going to work now. All of it's going to work, and in a year or two, we're going to be reaping the rewards. In a year, we're going to suddenly have high growth. That's what she thinks. I'm going to just move that down there. So I do think she is crazy. Absolutely. So what do the Tories have to do? They do have to get rid of her, but they also have to get someone in who will not only... They have to get someone in who will move the party back to the centre. It's really this simple. A general election is a battle for the centre. 2019, the first time in my entire life when it wasn't. And the reason why the Conservatives could still win it without fighting for the centre ground is because Labour abandoned it. And the Tories were still the party of government. So all those people in the centre who didn't really like either prospect were just convinced that Jeremy Corbyn was more of an extremist than Boris Johnson. That's what it came down to. Ultimately, that's what it came down to. You know, like better the devil you know, basically. So this time Labour have captured the centre again. They're on centre ground. That's where the voters are. The Conservatives are nowhere near still. So they need someone to shift that vote back to the centre. They have to. That's why I think Labour are now going to win, because I don't think Labour are going to slip up, and I do not see how the Conservatives can move back to the centre. I just don't see it. Peter, they're saying the well is poisoned beyond repair. Even if the Tories revert back to somewhat centrist policies they've done, I'm not sure about that. You know, I think the public have got an enormous capacity for the gross stupidity. But I do not think the Tories will do that. Whatever they need to do, they won't. So if they get rid of Truss, who are they going to get? Well, Rishi Sunak is sort of centrist, but again, he won't have enough control over his party. It's also fairly likely the members still won't want him. The members could still choose someone else over Sunak, because Sunak made a proper arse of that leadership contest. Also, bear in mind, polling suggested he would have lost against Penny Mordaunt as well, and she's going to feature strongly again. You know, if they let Boris Johnson back in, disaster. And he's not going to shift them back to the centre either. He'll shift them a little bit further left where they are now, because Liz Truss shifted it to the right, but still. I know someone who worked under Truss and said she would come up with tasks that didn't exist when there was nothing to do. The vibe I got, she was utterly insane. I mean, I'm happy to believe it now. I'm actually happy to believe she is doolally, completely and utterly in La La Land. But anyway. A former Oxford tutor has said that even when confronted with the facts, this will be Oxford specifically, Liz Truss still would not change her mind. Well, I mean, I'll go on then. Playing devil's advocate here. Could the Tories split, and if so, would that make Starmer be able to call a general election? No. If there's going to be an early general election now, it's hard to see it, because you would need one of two things to happen. You would either need Liz Truss to trigger a general election, which no, would she? I'm trying to think under what circumstances. It's a bit like Boris Johnson, isn't it? There was talk that when it came down to it, if Boris Johnson was going to be forced out of office, he might have, just out of spite, trigger a general election. There was even talk amongst some of his allies. There was a suggestion that Boris Johnson had actually asked about the feasibility of it. Would he get away with it? I don't know what the answer was, but there was a suggestion in the press, depending on who you believe, that Boris Johnson had voiced the possibility. Liz Truss could try do the same thing. She wouldn't need many. The ERG would back her, I suppose. She wouldn't need much. The problem is, how does it help her? Because even if in her own head she thinks she could win a general election after a year, does she think she could win it right now? And I know she's not going right now. I don't expect that as soon as Parliament comes back, there'll be moves to get rid of her. I mean, anything could happen, but I don't expect that. I think MPs at the moment will be, they'll focus on trying to change her first. You know, because they know it'll be deeply damaged to try and get rid of her. So yeah, but if there is to be a general election, either she has to say, I want a general election, and there'll be enough of her MPs along with the opposition to put it through, or about 40 or 50 Tory rebels have to want one. That's political suicide. So I'm not sure I see it. But in terms of where she is now, or where the Tories are now, basically they've got their conference starting tomorrow. Kwasi Kwarteng is speaking to the, I can't remember if it's Monday or Tuesday. It's 4 p.m. I think it's Monday. I think he's talking on Monday. And then I gather Liz Truss is delivering a speech, I think on Wednesday. So that'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see how the markets react to what Kwasi Kwarteng says. He may not say anything new. He may just carry on saying what he's already been saying. Liz Truss, however, will have to say things. So it might be more interesting to see how the markets and the polls and the public polls, because just as there's been a flurry of polls this week with everything going on, there will also be one next week. Now, here's the thing. Several of the pollsters made it quite clear that the reason why Labour surged ahead so much was partly, it's down to a number of factors, but it's partly down to the fact Labour have had their conference, lots of positive news about Labour. Well, next week, the Tories are having their conference. So if there's lots of positive news about the Tories, then it's not just a case of they'll close the gap a bit. I expect that anyway, because the gap is huge. They should be able to close it right down, shouldn't they? We will see. Surely such a dramatic change in travel from the manifesto requires a general election. Yes, they have no mandate at all. But in reality, there's obviously no constitutional requirement for the government to keep any of their manifesto promises. All it does is it leaves open the possibility for the House of Lords to turn something down. Now, the House of Lords is very unlikely to turn down a budget, it has to be said. They don't do that. But there could be some other legislation that they decide to be arsey about. We will have to see. But basically, the Lords only lets legislation through that it thinks is bad if there's considered to be a public mandate for it. In other words, the party of government promised it in a manifesto. Why are Parliament not sitting for so long because of party conferences? Well, normally it's not that much of a disaster because the country is not having it, but we have at the moment. The reason is because MPs need to be able to attend it, and the purpose of Parliament is not just to debate things but to have votes, and it wouldn't be fair to hold votes when one of the major parties is distracted by their own conference and out the way. So it is fair enough to have a season where Parliament's in recess to allow for party political conferences. It's just that when there's a national emergency, you would think maybe you postpone it, because at the end of the day it's internal party matters. It's not more important than the country. But there it is. But the Tories are not going to... I can see them splitting with proportional representation, just like I can see Labour splitting further. But I can't see it beforehand, because there's no one else for the Tories to really... then there's no other route to power for the moneyed interests, if we say the corporate interests. There's no route to power if the Tories split into a centre-right party and a far-right party. How are they going to... They're not going to win power. It's not even like the two could form coalitions with each other, because they'll be standing candidates against each other. The reason why the Tories win so many elections, I mean, there's lots of things going in their favour. They have certainly the bulk of the print media on their side, but you know, these days quite a lot of any mainstream media is at least covering for them, if not actively campaigning for them. You know, they have plenty of money because of those corporate interests. They have very slick campaigns. They're very disciplined. Tory politicians, well, Tory MPs, usually councillors are complete cretins, but Tory MPs are usually very disciplined. And so there's a lot of things going in their favour, but number one is that they are pretty much guaranteed the right-wing vote, so they can afford to fight for the votes in the centre. Whereas Labour have to fight for the votes in the centre when they want to win, that is. But they also have to fight for quite a lot of left-wing votes. And the reasons for that is, first of all, there's a lot of Liberal Democrat voters on the centre-left, so they have to fight for those. The Green Party is basically a left-wing party, so they have to fight for those votes as well. And also, the left wing is very, very, very principled. Now, some of those principles may not always make sense, but they are very principled. People on the left are very principled, and they are so principled that they can be self-defeating enough to deliberately vote for a no-hoper party like the Socialist Workers' Party or the Communist Party or something, rather than the party that can credibly put some of their policies into practice. So, yeah, Labour has to fight all along the spectrum. Obviously, they concentrate in the centre because that's where most voters are. But it is there. Thoughts on the Labour file? Sorry if this has been spoken about before. It has been spoken about before, and I'm afraid I can't add anything because I haven't had time to actually find out what the bloody hell they even are. All I can say is, whatever they are, whether they're genuine or not, they're having zero impact. Because if I haven't really, I am now aware of them, but if I haven't really come across them, it's because it's not being featured in any form of media that the bulk of people are watching. Al Jazeera, I gather, have produced them, so I suppose large sections of the Muslim population may be, but I don't think it's really cutting through. Because if it was in any population, surely it would feature in the mainstream media by now. If we got rid of the party political model of government, there'd be no time wasting conferences. No, there wouldn't. But the question you have to ask yourself is, how does any government function without a party system? How can it function? You imagine Parliament, right? How can it function if each MP is only acting? Remember, there are 3 priorities for an MP outside of party politics. There's their own interest, because let's be honest, a lot of politicians are self-serving. Not all, a lot of them. So there's their self-interest. Second, there's their constituency interests. And third, there's the national interest. This is outside party politics. How are you going to get a load of MPs who are not part of any party system, and there's no discipline at all, to agree on anything? How? It just wouldn't be possible, would it? The party system evolved not to subvert democratic systems, but to make them work. You know, party politics is like democracy. It's actually a shit system, but you know what? There isn't a better one. It's just better than everything else, that's all. Democracy is a terrible system because it means people who are like, it goes back to the George Carlin thing, doesn't it? He says, you know, imagine how stupid the average person is, and then realise that half the people are stupider than that. There was someone else, I think he might have been a physicist, it was some academic anyway, who said many years ago, he says he gets the idea that in democracy that one ignorant person is worth the same as a genius. He's fine with that. He's totally fine with that. Where he has a problem is when two idiots are worth more than one genius. And that's what democracy is. It's a system where the gullible and the ignorant and the willfully blind can outnumber people who actually know what's going on. So it's a terrible system. It's just that it's better than anything else. There is nothing. The ideal system is wise, benevolent dictatorship, but there's no such thing. Every now and then you'll get lucky, and then the rest of the time you won't. Whiggism is the future. I'm pretty sure it's the past. Wouldn't this election be perfect for PR? Isn't a large part of the electorate tired of one party running? Yes, absolutely. The best time to introduce proportional representation is always today. Always will be. You know, if someone would like to come up with a better system, that's fine by me. And there are different forms of proportional representation. For me, it's really this simple. Right, look at this here, this graphic. This is from Electoral Calculus. It's actually quite good. I put this one up because it's not only got the predicted seats based on the latest polling, but it's got because obviously everything's very tight and all the rest of it. And you can see huge errors here, huge margins for like the swing from the low to the high here. So people may have come across some of the polls modelling like the Tories only winning about 60 seats, for example, worst case scenario for them. But you look at this. So if we go to here, if we look at the predicted seats, this is most likely. Labour, it reckons, would win 45% of the vote. That would translate into 388 seats. There's 650 seats in Parliament. That is a stonking majority. That is pretty much where, in fact, that's actually a little bit better than the Tories got, really. Was it about the same? But it's round about there. Sorry, it will be lagging. Yeah, I did have a note. I did reset the router. It seemed to make no difference. But yeah, so Labour would have 45% of the vote, which is not a majority. It's a minority, and yet they would have a majority of the seats, which would give them 100% of the power. So there you go. Proportional representation should hold. If this was the vote distribution, and this doesn't include some of the Northern Irish parties, by the way, this just includes the main ones active in Britain. If proportional representation, it is raining, sorry. If proportional representation was in place, the Conservatives would get 30% of the seats in Parliament. Labour would get 45% of them. So they'd have more than the Conservatives, but they wouldn't have enough to just do whatever they wanted. They would need some help. The Liberal Democrats would get 11% of them. Well, the Liberal Democrats and Labour, if they agree on some things, well, they can go ahead with that. They could even form a coalition. The coalition wouldn't be stonking, but it would be okay. Reform UK would get some seats. They'd get some seats. What would they get? They'd get about 32, 33 seats. That's fine. That's okay. 33 little Farages, no problem at all. Do I think Labour should stand in Northern Ireland? No, there's no point. I'm trying to think if they even do. I don't think they do, actually. The Conservatives technically do. No one really makes much of it. Technically, some of the parties do have candidates in Northern Ireland. They get nowhere because there's no chance. I think the SDLP is the closest. That's basically the Northern Ireland's Labour. I'm not sure it's affiliated, but that is the Northern Ireland Labour Party, basically the SDLP, isn't it? UK wouldn't need reform if we had PR. No, I think there's still. I think we should still reform it. Like, I mean, again, I come down to it like this. The basic premise of the UK should be much more like a confederacy. It didn't really seem to know what it was. It worked for quite a while, you know, because obviously when the Union formed, like particularly when Scotland joined with England and Wales, there was a common purpose. You know, so there was a common purpose, there was alignment there. Everyone, all of the people in power, bear in mind, in like the start of the 18th century, hardly any bugger was allowed to vote. The people who decided who the government was were the people with money, with property. So, you know, they all made out of it. So everything was aligned. It's only like more recently where the general yeomanry who get to decide who the government is, but aren't necessarily gaining out of things. So, you know, there's a lot of there's a lot of things that Westminster deal with that they don't need to deal with, that things that could be devolved. You know, education sort of already is devolved, so why isn't it properly devolved? You know, health, why isn't it properly devolved? Why isn't it more like the state and federal systems of the United States? Or, better still, why isn't it more like the EU? So, you know, Westminster would be like the EU Parliament. The government would be like the EU Commission. But the devolved parliaments could be like the EU Council. You know, so similar to that. Obviously, it's not exactly the same because the EU Council don't have tax raising powers, whereas, you know, the devolved parliaments would need them. Sorry, Rain, there's nothing. Again, at some point in the future, don't know when, it might be in a couple of weeks, it might be in a couple of months, I will be inside properly. And then I can also order the fibre optic broadband, which has a delay, so it won't be overnight. But, you know, at some point, many of the problems will be solved. Confederacy or federation, aren't they the same? They don't have to be now. A confederacy is just the idea of a nation being made of, in many ways, autonomous parts. So like in America, individual states have very wide-ranging powers. They're basically like mini nations of their own. It's almost like a feudal system where you've got the barons who still owe allegiance to the king type of thing, only more democratic. It's not entirely democratic in America because they don't have proportional representation either, but there you go. What are the chances of PR in the first term of the Labour government given Starmer's statement after the conference vote? So, right, in fact, I've been waiting to use this little thought experiment. Sorry, the rain's really coming down. And I'll just do this close to my face. Little thought experiment for you. So, as I keep saying, I will preface this by saying I have no idea whether Keir Starmer genuinely wants to go with proportional representation or not. We cannot tell from what he said. If Keir Starmer was dead keen on bringing in PR as soon as possible, we wouldn't know from any statement he would make. The reason is you have to bring it on quite late on. If you're going to announce it in the manifesto, I keep saying, announce it. Oh my God. Announce, even closer. Announce it as it's going to the printers. Announce it as you launch the manifesto. Give the Tory press only about 6 or 7 weeks to panic about it. But I don't know that he wants it. But here's a thought experiment as to why you should do that. So, consider some statements that Labour have made. Think about nationalisation of the railways. So, I mean, Starmer already hinted at this before summer, but Louise Haigh, the Shadow Transport Secretary, who's dead keen on the idea, was able to announce it at conference formally. It is raining, yes, thank you. So, think about this. So, Louise Haigh has confirmed that when Labour are in government, as different rail operators' contracts come up for, because remember, it's not fully privatised. They have, it's like franchised out. So there's contracts, right? She said, as the contracts come to an end, Labour will not renew them. So they will nationalise the railways without buying companies, which is expensive and the public don't want, or at least the target voting public don't want. Just let the contracts fade, don't renew them. Nationalisation without the cost. So then you think about this. As soon as they announced it, I thought, okay, good policy. Was it wise to announce it yet? Consider what you would do if you were the Tory government and you wanted to stop this. I'll tell you what I would do. I'd wait until I'm a few months out from the election, and then I would renegotiate those contracts with all the rail companies, and I would give them a 6-year contract. That will stop Labour nationalising any of the railway in their first term in office. What's to stop them doing that? Now, they might not do it because they might not be that arsed. I mean, bear in mind, the Conservatives have already brought at least one network, is it LNER? They brought them into public ownership. So it's not like they're that bothered about it. But if they were, the fact that Labour have announced it means the Tories could do something to stop it. Now, you think about the same sort of thing with PR. In that case, it's not a case of like the government doing something as such, but the media could poison that well. If you think about the Brexit referendum, people in this country weren't in favour of leaving the EU. You look at polls stretching years before, there was never a majority for leaving the EU. If you look at polls after the referendum, there was not a majority for leaving the EU. The majority existed for the space of a few days, timed to hit. So they had a very sophisticated campaign, timed to hit, to have maximum impact on the day of the vote. They will do the same with PR. So Labour cannot announce it far in ahead. But anyway, I have more rain in Scotland. I need to learn to deal with it. I do know how to deal with it. It's by moving in. As soon as my daughter's eldest has moved out, I'm moving in. But anyway, problem with devolving education in schools at different parts of the country will have drastically different tax rates. But again, the tax raising powers can be devolved as well for that. The central government, Westminster, only needs... Part of the problem is we don't have an English Parliament. We should probably have 3 or 4 of them. But that's the problem. Westminster should just purely be for UK matters. So defence. Obviously, you don't devolve defence, for Christ's sake. We don't need another civil war. So defence, foreign affairs, international trade. You know, energy policy, there is a good argument for it. You could devolve it, but there is also a strong argument for keeping energy policy largely national. You know, say any resources like, you know, water and so on like that. You know, DEFRA, environment and farming, some of it can be devolved. There is an argument for having some of it also centralised. But there's so many government departments. In fact, let's go through. Hold on, let's go through. I had them up here. Let's go through what you could devolve. Ministry of Justice. Yes, that's the court system. That's devolved anyway. Different court system in Scotland. So yes, you could. Now, you would still, I suppose, have a Westminster Department because the Supreme Court, which is independent, but nonetheless that's UK-wide, that's your constitutional court. The Treasury, okay, yeah, you need the Treasury. Foreign and Commonwealth Office, yes, you still need that. Home Office, don't need that. Don't need Westminster to deal with policing at all, in any way, shape or form. That can be fully devolved. Defence, yeah, you keep that. You don't devolve that. Department for Levelling Up is a made-up department anyway. We know they're not doing any levelling up. Department for Health and Social Care, that can all be devolved. That doesn't need to be a UK-wide strategy. Business, energy, industrial strategy, I would keep that. International trade, obviously you have to keep that central. Department for Work and Pensions, partly, but most of that can be devolved. Department for Education, that can be devolved. DEFRA, yeah, you keep that. Department for Transport, a small department for Westminster, most of that can be devolved. And then you wouldn't need a Northern Ireland office, a Scotland office, or a Welsh office. Wouldn't need it. Why would you? You just have someone who is a liaison with the devolved administrations. You know, that's it. Culture, media and sport, you don't need that. No need for that. That can be devolved. Pissing sports devolved anyway. Right, we have separate home nations football and rugby teams. What bloody need is there for a centralised sports department? As for culture, media, no. That can all be devolved. Or most of that can be devolved. We don't need Westminster to be anywhere near as influential as it is. And I'll tell you another benefit of it. DEFRA, sorry, is the Department for the Environment, Farming and Rural Affairs. So basically environment and farming. So you keep that. Yeah, you keep that national. We don't want messing about there. But the other benefit of it is, so take for example, so at the moment there's a big hoo-ha in Scotland about McVitie's closing down, sort of announced I think last year, or it's very likely to be McVitie, and that's worth a lot of money to the local economy, right? 50 million quid I think a year. It's a lot of jobs going with it, and a lot of jobs in the supply chain. So obviously everyone that's not in the SNP is blaming the SNP because they are the Scottish government. The Scottish government inevitably will be blaming Westminster or Brexit or something. Now, I'll be perfectly honest, I have no idea. I genuinely don't know whose fault it is. The fact of the matter, however, is when you do have a devolved administration, they will always claim that everything that good happens is them and everything that bad happens is the national government. And it's in reverse for the national, like the Westminster government, the central government. Westminster will blame the devolved governments for everything that goes tits up, and they will claim the credit for anything that goes well in Scotland, Wales, or third lines of responsibility, really. But as far as the public are concerned, it's like I don't know. I've tried to look it up. I don't know whose fault it is. Partly because I don't actually know what reason McVitie's have given, because they haven't. And even if they had given a reason, would I trust it? I don't know. So because I don't know why they've closed down, I can't actually surmise who's responsible. I'm perfectly happy to believe it is Brexit and therefore the Westminster government. I don't know that. But anyway, Labour could remove all rail subsidies and freeze fares. Certainly Labour could make it very uncomfortable. I mean, I'd argue this as well. So at the start of summer, when I did my video, ironically, suggesting that what Labour could do was, it's too expensive, despite what the TU say, to nationalise energy. But what you could do is create a state-owned energy company to compete with the others. Lo and behold, that's what they've done. And I did also suggest of the railways that what you could actually be allowed to impose on them conditions that drive them out of business, but they can squeeze their profits. The government could absolutely regulate and squeeze their profits, yes. They'd have to be careful not to contravene the terms of the agreement. Again, the Tories, when I say they renegotiate a contract, it's not just a case of give them a contract. They could make sure there's clauses in it that protect them from anything that Labour might do. But Labour could certainly, within the condition, because otherwise those companies will just take the government to court and they'll just get loads of money out of us. But within the confines of the contract, the Labour government could just make it uncomfortable for them. But there we go. We need to nationalise hobnobs and Jaffa cakes. Oh, absolutely. I had some Jaffa cakes last week, very briefly. They don't last long. But anyway, To be fair, our current Westminster government doesn't take credit for anything bad that happens, either Brexit, COVID, global problem, Remainers, etc. No, but they no, they don't. Everything good because of them, everything bad because of the wider authority. That's exactly how it used to be between Westminster and EU. Yeah, and this was part of the problem. This is how the Brexiteers, partly how they managed to win, because so many governments were particularly conservative governments, were happy, but it wasn't always them, were happy to go along with this notion that, oh, blame the EU, we'll just blame the EU, you know, and instead of being honest with people. And it allowed the view that the EU was excessively bureaucratic to become mainstream, which was fertile soil for the Brexiteers, certainly. Can we attach Truss to a rocket? No. It's against human rights laws. Can't do that. What we can do is prosecute her after she's left office. We won't do, but we could do, because as someone again at the start of the video noted, there's a story in, I think it's the Sunday Times tomorrow, saying that after Kwasi Kwarteng delivered his budget, he met with hedge fund managers for a champagne reception. Hedge fund managers that made an absolute killing betting against the pound and did very nicely in the last week, thank you very much. And they urged him to double down, which is exactly what he did. Basically, you'd have to be very, very gullible not to realise that either Kwasi Kwarteng or Liz Truss has tipped hedge fund managers off about what was going to be said. So there is absolutely scope, and that's illegal, by the way. That's insider trading. So there's absolutely scope for both Truss and Kwarteng and anyone else, because there's only a small number of people who knew what was going to be in that budget. Anyone who knew what was going to be in that statement to be prosecuted, to be investigated, I should say, and if evidence turns up, prosecuted. You say, I suspect we would. Phil mentioned human rights. Isn't Truss trying to get rid of those? Actually, she's not. No. You're thinking of the Boris Johnson government. Liz Truss, actually, one of the first things to do, to be fair to her, was the idea was that we were going to get rid of the Human Rights Act and introduce our own Bill of Rights. That's what Dominic Raab was on with. Oops, sorry. Liz Truss has knocked that on the head. That's done. That's gone. She's not interested in that. She's interested in her economic experimentation. She's not that bothered about the culture wars. She's made Suella Braverman Home Secretary, so that's the culture wars sorted. She's not bothered about them. I didn't hear anything about Labour stopping the water companies pumping huge amounts of pollution into our seas and rivers while letting those companies make huge profits. No, they didn't. That being said, at the time we were in the EU, so we did actually used to get wrapped quite a lot when the water quality went up. So, I mean, we did used to monitor water quality and there were still laws in place. So it's not like it is now. But you are quite right that the Labour government did not force the water companies, who at the time had been privatised for a fair few years, but still, it hadn't been that long. It'd been like less than 10 years, and did sort of allow them to they should have made them uncomfortable, and they didn't. You're quite right. Can we save the NHS? It's becoming very difficult now. The problem is the NHS, obviously, it's not just a case of fund it properly and all of a sudden it'll be fine. The NHS requires hospitals, doctors, nurses, lots of medical equipment, lots of other staff come to it. You know, it needs a lot of resources. The Conservatives, over 12 and a half years so far, and it'll be 14 and a half years before they're done, they have so far, I've just seen a comment that's made me smile there, I'll come to that in a minute. They've been stripping away those resources. So when Labour come into power, what our national healthcare system is a much more trimmed down NHS and private capacity. So like this is what, and Wes Streeting gets shit for saying we're going to have to use that private capacity to get queues down, as if some people say no, we should only use the NHS. There are some people tapped in the head. They say, oh no, we should have no private healthcare at all paid for by public funds. It's like, okay, so you just want to use the state controlled NHS? Yeah, right, then we won't be able to treat anyone. There'll be the waiting times will stay really high. In fact, they'll be higher than under the Tories. Is that what we want? No, we have to do that. Now, you have to then invest alongside it so that we can build up the size of the NHS again. But the NHS is now really small. BMJ saying 40% of GPs leaving in the next 5 years, basically stuff. Yeah, we are absolutely knackered. And this is a massive problem for Labour. They've talked about doubling the number of spaces at university on medical courses. That will take more than a full parliament. That takes 2 full parliaments before you see the difference there. But that's, you know. But anyway, I'll come back to this thing before I miss it. Someone said here, sorry, it's 999 Shian. Sean? I don't know. You need to be active in your CLP, Phil. I'll tell you how funny that is. In fact, I might even be able to show you how funny that is. Right, let me show you. Hold on. I had this ready to talk about little polling. So this is a map. I was actually going to point out a few things. I'd still quite like to. Let me find me. This is me, Brig and Gore, right? This is after the polling, bear in mind. This is disastrous for the Tories. My Tory candidate, it looks like he's going to lose 22% of the share of the vote, and he's still going to win it handsomely. Yeah? This is safe Tory area. My CLP here, I have attended every single meeting since I've moved here. That's one meeting. There were 8 people at that meeting. I don't have a CLP, basically. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. It's not there. Your CLP, well, which one? Let's put it up. Which one is that? I mean, this is obviously based on the polling from this week. I do not anticipate this being credible for the actual election, but it is very interesting, and it would indicate some swinging. Banbury. Oh, I don't even know where that is. Hold on. Banbury. Has it highlighted it for me? I don't know what it's done. Oh, down there. Has it highlighted it for me? I have no idea where it even is. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I'll tell you what I did want to point out. So, in terms of south, oh yeah, the south's all the way over. This is the south. Everything under here is the south. My geography is not very good. I could just go around here and here and here. But Oxfordshire, all right, you right, I don't even know where pissing Oxfordshire is. I'm not going to look for it. It doesn't matter. I'll take your word for it. Right, I'll tell you what I will point out though. And this is where, so if we look here, Brecon and Radnorshire, this was an interesting. Okay, I do know where Birmingham and London are at least. Go on then. Is it this pokey little thing here? That's Slough. I don't know what I'm doing this for. I'm just going to take your word for it. Right, never mind. No, back to Brecon and Radnorshire. So this became famous for. Okay, I'll look south of the Thames in a minute. This became famous in 2019. Brecon and Radnorshire in Wales, but a rural area Tory seat basically, and it is a Tory seat at the moment. But in 2019, the Tory MP, and I'm quite prepared to believe he meant no bad, but he did technically break the law. He fiddled expenses. It wasn't really, and I don't want to. It wasn't in a really corrupt way. It was, I quite prepared to believe he made a genuine mistake. It was perfectly understandable. I don't need to go over it. But the fact of the matter was, he did break the law, and it meant a recall, which meant a by-election. And the Liberal Democrats won that by-election, right? Then they lost it in the election. But I'll tell you what's really interesting here. You remember I'll read it out to you. Now, it still shows the Conservatives gaining it, but it shows the Conservatives losing 14.7% of the vote. It shows the Lib Dems losing 4.9% of the vote, and it shows Labour gaining 12.2% of the vote. And the reason for that is this forecast is, it's not like in a general, well, it sort of is and it sort of isn't. It's based on certain things which nationally have proved to be very accurate. So if people are going, oh, you know, how can you turn these polling results into national predictions? They are actually, they've been proved. YouGov are the ones who came up with this system, and it's proven to be quite accurate when measured against actual general elections. The last two general elections, they've sort of used it and they've been pretty good. So it's worth considering. But there is one way in which it can still be unable to cope with reality. This seat, Brecon and Radnorshire, Labour have no chance of winning it, and the Lib Dems do have a chance of winning it. And we know that Labour are basically going to butt out of any seat that is a Lib Dem target, and the Lib Dems are going to do the same with Labour targets. And the only difference, the only exception to that is Sheffield Hallam, which is Labour, between Labour and the Lib Dems, so it's not helping the Tories at all. So you look at this and you think to yourself, like, that has the Conservatives on 38.4%, Lib Dems 31%, looks like a sizable difference. But if Labour don't gain there, because they, apart from the local party will be out, but hopefully they'll have the good sense not to be out in force, but the party machine will send no one. The National Labour Party will put no resources into it at all, not a sausage. And the Lib Dems, if they see it as a target, will fight for it very hard. So you could see... Basingstoke. No, I'm not. I'll take your word for it. You could see that one actually being much closer than it really is. And the same thing can happen elsewhere as well. Because I noticed things like here. You know, a couple of Lib Dem gains here from the Conservatives. But again, it has... Labour gaining vote share and the Lib Dems losing it. But why would Labour gain it if they can't win? They're not going to, because they're not going to campaign very hard there. So although the national picture is going to be pretty good here, the some individual seats could actually be impacted by that. It's not really a pact, but it sort of is. The understanding between Labour and the Lib Dems that they're not going to waste resources targeting each other's targets. So it could well be that this picture, if anything, is on the optimistic side for the Conservatives. But anyway, is a government of national unity out of the question? Yes, realistically, yes. Yeah. The thing is, you've got to think about what they're fighting for. There was a government of national unity on the cards in 2019. There were Tory MPs who were prepared to work with Labour and any opposition party, Conservative MPs quite willing to work to form a government with Labour and others, but that was to stop Brexit. Labour refused, of course. But that was to stop Brexit. That was a particular goal in mind. It wasn't for the purposes of governing for the long term. It was purely for the purposes of getting that second referendum out, dealing with the immediate aftermath, and then a general election. And they were obviously prepared to do that and prepared to commit personal political suicide to do it. The same thing doesn't exist now. What would be the purpose of a government of national unity? What would it do? Tories and Labour are not going to agree on the way forward. You know, if you're talking about 50 Tory MPs joining with Labour and others to form a government of national unity, they're not going to. The SNP are going to want one set of things. Labour are going to want another. Tories are going to want another. There's no real common ground. The only common ground is they may all agree that Liz Truss is batshit crazy and that she's going to do lasting harm to the economy. But there's no end game to it. Like, there was an end game in 2019. the Brexit referendum, dealing with the aftermath, general election. Here, what would they do? There isn't anything to achieve. Have they created an interactive map yet for the UK political changes over the past 20 years or so? I possibly someone's done something like that. There will always be things like, I mean, people do, you know, political analysts do spend a lot of time coming up with a lot of resources. But again, I mean, that map and these predictions here, which are sort of based on it, do remember that is as a result of last week's polling. Last week's polling is very, very not likely to carry on. The Conservative MPs cannot survive this. I mean, the best case scenario here, look at the best case scenario for the Tories. Let's say they're on the upper end of this prediction, which is 279 seats, and Labour on the low end, 284. That's still the Tories out of government. It's not necessarily a bad outcome, because that is a very weak Labour government. That is a seriously weak Labour government. It won't be able to do half the things it wants to do. But I'll tell you what it will have to do. Introduce proportional representation, otherwise it won't be able to govern at all. That is also bad news for the Tories. So actually, if you look at it, there's no good outcome for the Tories from this poll. So they can't let it continue. Like, their best case scenario means proportional representation. Their worst case scenario means Labour have so much power they can pretty much do what they like. They could actually make the Tory party illegal. Imagine that, banning them like the BNP or the National Front. The political arena has to change. Climate emergency at least demands consensus. Yes, politics has changed. I mean, this is what people are at pains to point out. You know, when people are comparing, obviously, inevitably, people are comparing Labour now with Labour just before it took power under Blair. The country is very different. Voters have got very different attitudes. So, you know, Labour can't just, like, Tony Blair would never have got away with some of the policies Starmer's come out with. Starmer wouldn't get away with some of the policies that worked for Blair. It's totally different now. People have a different focus, different concerns. The important thing was, ultimately what Labour needed was a platform to stand on and appeal to voters that the Conservatives couldn't challenge. And they've now got that. You know, so they've got that now. So I think they're basically set. As I say, from their point of view, there's an immense amount of work. But from my point of view as an observer, I can just think, yeah, it's going to be a Labour government now. And then we'll see what happens to the channel. Because that is my existential threat, Labour actually forming a government. But, you know, I would welcome that. Aren't we really too polite in this country, allowing someone to stay in power who's doing provable damage? I know about democracy, what about mutiny on the bounty? Well, this is why we're sort of like not quite the polar opposite of the French, but we are very, very different. You know, the government even looks like trying to introduce. Didn't the French government try and do something last week that created a load of protest and then they backed down immediately? In this country, the government have just suffered a polling collapse, and yet they're still not even slightly modifying their approach. The French government get a load of like people in yellow jackets looking a bit agitated, and they go, oh, we might be going a bit too far here, we'd better rethink it. Quite incredible. Could Labour enforce Leveson 2? If you mean by Leveson 2 the full recommendations of the Leveson inquiry, yes. I'll tell you, in fact, we'll finish off with this because I was reading something written by Andrew Marr. You know, he was the Tory stooge on the BBC who's now sort of free to speak his own mind and is a bit less of a Tory stooge now. He said something interesting which I'd not really considered. So there was an article in the Telegraph yesterday, I think it was, that was trying to basically say about the polling, but Keir Starmer still remains fundamentally unelectable. And it's like, yeah, okay, whatever, mate. But Mar pointed something out, and that is that there's a lot of editors in the media, in the British media, the print media, that absolutely hate Keir Starmer's guts. Not because he's leader of Labour, not because he's likely to make them electable, but because he's the one who prosecuted them during the phone hacking scandal. So there are some editors out there who've got it in for him personally, and it could be one of two things. Mar didn't actually elaborate, but I can. You know, it could be personal, that they just fundamentally want him to lose, to fail, because they hate him, because he prosecuted them. And secondly, it could be exactly because of that, because Keir Starmer not just could put in the full Levinson recommendations, but that he would. You know, he was the prosecutor who dealt with that. It's almost certain that he would put those in place. The Sun was trying to tie his speech in with Meghan Markle. Gordon. I'm afraid I can't. Like, I will occasionally read things in the Daily Mail or the Daily Express. I sort of need to know what the crazies are being told. I have to draw the line at the Sun. I'll occasionally see a tweet from Cole, who's like the political editor there, Harry. But you know, I have to draw the line at the Sun. God, it's really absolutely insane, isn't it? But anyway, I think Starmer's managed to pull off patriotic socialism, judging from his conference speech and comments I've heard from those who've shifted their position towards Labour. Yeah, it was a stunningly successful conference. I did not anticipate it to be that thing. And ordinarily you would think, because the Tories did upstage it, the Tories actually drowned out quite a lot of the news focus of the Labour conference. And yet, it resulted in the biggest lead Labour have had, poll lead, that they've had in 2 decades. Anyway, which newspaper would I recommend? Byline Times. It is unfortunately a little bit dry. I think that's where it has its problem. It doesn't really focus enough on like delivery. And it's like I always say, engagement is more important. But it is the best print media we have, and it's obviously available online as well, that we have. No UK newspaper is as cracked as the Express. None. Well, maybe out the mainstream papers you may be right, but there is the Spectator. Which newspaper do I think Truss reads? See, normally I would think something like the Telegraph. That's the typical sort of paper for like your upper middle class Tories. But you know, it's you don't think Truss reads? Well, in all honesty, neither do I. She certainly doesn't read her briefs, does she? She gets tripped up so easily. But anyway, right, Sunday Sport. I don't think she does read the Sunday Sport. I really don't think she reads the Morning Star either. But I'll leave it there. Thanks very much, everyone, for coming on. We'll be back again next week. Hopefully the internet will behave a little bit better then. But have a good evening, everyone. Until next time, I'll see you later.